A widow's umbrella vanished, but inside it hid something far more dangerous. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Your messages truly bring this channel to life. Let's uncover the mystery. The window of the Quai des Orfèvres office gave onto the Seine, but the view was dulled by the persistent veil of drizzle that had clung to Paris since dawn. It wasn't the sort of rain that made anyone rush or grumble, just enough to sink into your collar without protest, enough to mist the glass so that the barges on the river became silhouettes, gliding slowly like old memories. Maigret was not behind his desk. His coat hung on the hook, damp and giving off the faint scent of wool and tobacco. He stood by the stove instead, holding a heavy porcelain mug between both hands, the kind that had a chipped lip he always turned away from. The coffee had long cooled, but he hadn't noticed. A small, gray envelope rested on the corner of his desk, unopened. Its presence wasn't urgent. A note from the concierge, probably, or his wife, mentioning something mundane like the fishmonger forgetting the cod cheeks again. There was comfort in the normality of it. He wasn't eager to disrupt that quiet. Outside, the faint sound of traffic moved like a tired sigh through the wet streets. Paris had a way of folding into itself when it rained. Cafes growing smaller, footsteps slower, voices muffled. Maigret enjoyed these days more than he admitted. They reminded him of being a young inspector posted in Moulins, trailing suspects through damp alleys, the rhythm of a dripping gutter his only company. He liked the way rain slowed things down, made people say less, wait longer. Guilt never liked waiting. It twitched, it scratched at the corners of a man's calm. The door creaked open, and Lucas appeared, his slicked hair askew from the wind. He paused when he saw Maigret by the stove and hesitated before entering fully. "There's a woman downstairs," he said, brushing water from his shoulders. "Not sure what she wants. She asked for you specifically. Said it wasn't urgent." Maigret nodded but didn't move. "What sort of woman?" Lucas shifted. "Elderly, widow, I think. Black coat, veil. Said her name was Madame Le Sueur." Maigret exhaled softly. "And what does Madame Le Sueur want?" "She didn't say exactly, only that she's missing something. An umbrella." At that, Maigret finally sipped the cold coffee. It tasted like burnt bark. He didn't flinch. "An umbrella," he repeated. Lucas nodded. "She said it wasn't valuable, but that it mattered." Maigret placed the mug on the stove's edge. It was always like this. The rain, the silence, and then some ordinary object tugging at the thread of something else. He reached for his coat. "Send her up." A few minutes passed, and the door opened again. Madame Le Sueur stepped in with the sort of hesitation Maigret had seen in hundreds of people before. Not fear, not embarrassment exactly, but that vague unease that came from bringing a private trouble into a public room. She was thin and dry, like a withered leaf. Her coat buttoned all the way up, a veil still clinging to her pale cheeks, though there hadn't been a burial. She carried no bag, no papers, only a gloved hand, curled around the handle of a folded umbrella that wasn't hers. Maigret gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Madame Le Sueur, please, sit." She did so carefully, smoothing her coat as she folded herself into the chair. Her eyes were small and alert, like a robin's darting to the stove, the window, his face. "I hope I'm not intruding, monsieur," she began in a voice like thin lace. "I know this isn't a usual matter for your attention." "Tell me," Maigret said simply. She took a moment, organizing her thoughts with the prime precision of someone who had learned to do without help. "My husband passed in January," she said. "Heart failure. We lived on the Rue du Chemin Vert, near the canal. Since then I've kept things as they were. It helps to keep to a rhythm." Maigret nodded once. He didn't interrupt. "Every Thursday, I go to the same cafe on the corner. I sit under the awning, even when it rains. The waiter knows me. I have coffee and I watch people." She paused, brushing an invisible thread from her lap. "Last Thursday, it began to rain more heavily. I opened my umbrella to leave, But it wasn't mine. Mine has a silver handle. This one was wooden. Same shape, same color, but not mine. Maigret lit his pipe without comment. The room filled with the smell of tobacco and rain-soaked wool. Could someone have taken it by mistake? He asked after a moment. Of course, she said. That's what I thought. But the next day, it was returned. Not to me. It was in the hallway of my building. Mine, leaning against the radiator, with the ferrule still damp. Someone had been holding it in the rain. Maigret studied her. She wasn't mad, not confused. Something had unsettled her. But not the umbrella. And the other one. Gone, she said. Taken back, swapped again, like a courtesy. She paused. But mine smells different now. Maigret didn't smile. He looked out the misted window a moment. Why come to me, Madame Lesueur? Because the next day I found my kitchen drawer slightly open. I never leave it like that. Her hands tightened on the fabric of her coat. I think someone came in. Someone who wanted me to know they had. The umbrella was resting on her knees now. Maigret stood, crossed to the window, and stared at the blurred rooftops beyond. Was anything taken? No. Broken? No. But I don't sleep as well now. Maigret turned. He walked to his desk and gently took the umbrella from her knees. He examined the tip, the ribs, the fabric. Nothing unusual, but that wasn't what he was looking for. All right, he said finally. Give me your address. She did. He wrote it down without comment. As she stood, she hesitated. I know it sounds foolish. No, Maigret said simply. It sounds like something someone wanted you to feel. He held the umbrella out to her. She reached for it, then paused. I'd rather you keep it for now. He nodded. When she was gone, Maigret looked at the umbrella again. It was just an umbrella, but the room had felt colder since it arrived, and it was raining still. He didn't move for a long while. He just listened to the drip of water outside and the quiet ticking of something beginning. The next morning the sky hung low and colorless, swollen with more rain that never quite fell, only misted. Maigret left the office shortly after 8, not in haste but with a sense of quiet pull, as if the umbrella resting against the corner of his desk had whispered something to him during the night. He had not brought it home. He hadn't even mentioned the case to his wife, though she had eyed the coat he hung up with its lingering scent of damp and smoke, and said, "You've been thinking about something." He had merely grunted in reply. He took the metro, changed at Bastille, and exited into the grey pulse of Rue du Chemin Vert, a working street without charm or pretense. The sort of street where people didn't expect to be noticed, and so had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Shops with yellowing window displays, metal shutters stained by decades of soot, and apartment buildings that had never quite been renovated, only patched, dusted and endured. Number 86 stood halfway down, with a chipped green door and a bell that buzzed reluctantly when Maigret pressed it. No concierge, just a row of wooden mailboxes inside, each with a name handwritten in faded ink. Some scratched out, others rewritten over one another. He scanned the labels until he found Lesueur 3e étage gauche. The staircase smelled faintly of bleach and old varnish, and the floor creaked beneath his steps in a way that made him slow down out of habit. At each landing, the light from the transom window grew a little dimmer, the air a little more still. When he reached the third floor, he stood outside the left door for a moment, letting the silence speak. Behind the wood he heard nothing, not a radio, not a kettle whistling, not the small cough of someone startled into awareness. He knocked. After a pause, the door opened, and Madame Lesueur stood there, wearing the same coat she'd worn the day before, though this time unbuttoned to reveal a blue wool dress, modest and unadorned. She didn't look surprised to see him, only stepped aside silently to let him in. Her apartment was small and orderly. The sitting room opened directly off the corridor, its windows drawn against the milky daylight. Everything had a softness to it. The curtains, the worn chair cushions, the pale scent of lavender, and something more bitter, like liniment. A photograph of a man in military dress sat on the mantel, her husband presumably. Beside it, a dried bouquet of roses hung inverted, brittle and dark. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly, as she poured tea into 2 thick porcelain cups. "There's really nothing for the police in this." Maigret did not correct her. "I'm not here officially, only curious." She set the cup in front of him and sat across the narrow table. Her eyes were less darting today, more resolved, as if by speaking her unease aloud, she had accepted it. But there was still a tightness in her jaw, a weight in her hands. "You haven't had visitors lately?" Maigret asked. She hesitated. "The grocer, once a week. Madame Fleuret across the hall sometimes brings me brioche on Sundays, when she bakes. But otherwise, no children." No. He let that settle. He sipped the tea. It was weak, oversteeped. She seemed to watch him drink more than she drank herself. "Show me the drawer," he said. She rose, and he followed her into the kitchen, a narrow room with a rusted gas burner and oilcloth covering the table. She pointed to the lower cabinet beside the sink. "It's nothing," she said again. "It was only open a little. I just noticed it." He crouched and opened it fully. Inside were cooking utensils, a stack of clean rags, a bottle of vinegar, and some worn brushes. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, and yet Maigret could imagine the way a drawer left ajar could sit in the mind like a sliver of glass. He slid it shut gently. "Do you lock your door?" "Always, but the keyhole is old. It sticks." He ran his fingers along the frame. The latch had been painted over many times. It wouldn't take much to push it in with a firm twist of the wrist. He didn't comment. Back in the sitting room, she resumed her seat. Maigret remained standing, slowly observing the space, taking in the details, a teacup with a faint lipstick rim, though she wore none today, a basket by the door with folded shopping bags, 2 of them damp, and near the window a coat stand with a space left conspicuously empty. "You said you go to the cafe every Thursday." She nodded. "At 3. Always the same table. They keep it for me." "Which cafe?" "Café Martin. On the corner, with the green awning." He turned to the window and stared out at the street. A man walked by in a cap and scarf, hunched against the wind. Maigret asked, without turning, "You've lived here long?" "Since 1949. We moved here after my husband left the gendarmerie. He wanted quiet, and you felt safe." She gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I was never afraid before." It was the sort of line people said when they were trying to justify fear, as if the past could grant permission to feel something in the present. Maigret made a small noise in his throat and turned from the window. "May I speak to your neighbor, Madame Fleuret?" She blinked. "Yes, of course. But I don't think she—" He was already at the door. Across the hall, the knock was answered almost immediately by a small, round woman in a dressing gown and slippers. She had the pink complexion of someone who spent too much time near a stove, and smiled with wary politeness when he introduced himself. "Madame Lessire?" "Yes, we speak. Not often. She's quiet, keeps to herself, always polite." "Have you seen anything unusual lately?" She wrinkled her nose. "Besides her umbrella going missing." She chuckled awkwardly, then covered her mouth. "She told me about that. I said maybe someone took it by mistake. It's the kind of thing that happens, and then brought it back." Maigret asked. The woman hesitated. "I didn't know about that part. Anyone else visit her?" She shook her head. "No. Sometimes her niece used to, before her husband died. But not anymore. She's quite alone." That, Maigret thought, was often the most dangerous thing in Paris. Not the thieves, not the madmen, but the quiet, unnoticed loneliness of people who passed in and out of cafes and courtyards, like ghosts, never spoken to except at the till. He thanked her and returned to the apartment. Madame Lessire stood at the door, coat on now, fingers tightening her scarf. "I'm going to the cafe," she said. "It's Thursday." Maigret glanced at his watch. 10 minutes to 3. Do you mind if I walk with you? She paused. If you wish. But it will be the same as always. I'm counting on it, he said. They descended the stairs, slowly, her steps precise, his broad hand hovering near in case she faltered. When they emerged into the street, the wind had picked up slightly, tugging at the corners of her coat. She walked with purpose, eyes forward, and Maigret, slightly behind, watched her more than the path. The café was only half full, its awning pulled low, droplets clinging to the fabric edge. Madame Lesseur nodded to the waiter, a young man with tired eyes, who greeted her by name. She took her usual seat. Maigret remained standing, then chose a table 2 over, facing her. She did not look at him again. He ordered beer, lit his pipe, and watched. Not her, but everyone who watched her, and someone did. A man in the corner, who lifted his cup and sipped too often. A girl on the terrace, whose eyes flicked sideways once and then didn't return. Maigret leaned back. He was good at waiting. The rain began again. Maigret stayed at the café long after Madame Lesseur had finished her coffee. She took small, deliberate sips, her eyes never lingering too long in any one place, and yet her posture remained alert, as though part of her expected something or someone to arrive. The waiter brought her a second napkin without being asked, as though part of the routine, and when she folded her hands afterward, there was something in the gesture that seemed rehearsed. The café, meanwhile, murmured around her, the low hum of spoons on saucers, the static hiss of the radio behind the bar, the scrape of a chair leg on damp tile. No raised voices, no unusual tension, but Maigret knew to listen beyond the sound. The man in the corner, the one who lifted his cup too often, paid and left without looking at her. He wore a grey wool cap and kept his head down. When he passed Maigret's table, he hesitated a fraction too long, just enough for the inspector to notice the faint scent of soap and something sharper, menthol or camphor, not uncommon for a man of a certain age or certain nerves. Maigret waited 10 minutes more before he too stood and stepped outside. The rain had lessened again, the air holding that temporary clearness that often followed a soft downpour. The street glistened with puddles catching the pale sky, and the awning above the café still trembled with the occasional drop. He did not turn toward the office, nor back toward Madame Lesseur's building. Instead, he took Rue de la Folie Méricourt, in the direction the man had gone, not in pursuit but in idle curiosity, the way one follows a scent without meaning to. He didn't expect to find him, and yet, 3 blocks down, the man stood under the shelter of a tobacconist's, pretending to read the notices taped to the glass. Maigret slowed. When the man turned casually, too casually, their eyes met. He was younger than Maigret had assumed, perhaps 50, but drawn and pale, with deep-set eyes and a mouth that had learned to hide things. He did not acknowledge Maigret. He simply folded his paper, stepped into the street, and disappeared into a side alley, head low. Maigret made no move to follow. He had no reason, not yet, only a feeling, one of those slow, creeping sensations that settled in the base of the spine when something was beginning to form. Back at the office, the umbrella still rested where he had left it, its handle dark and dull in the gray afternoon light. He picked it up again, turned it in his hands. Silver handle, yes, slightly worn where the fingers would grip it most. A small dent along the brass ferrule. The fabric was thick, stitched carefully, with only one rib slightly bent. Not new, not valuable, but familiar, touched often by the same hands, over and over, until even the grain of the grip bore their story. He set it down again. Lucas entered with a file, which Maigret waved away. "I want a name," he said, "for a man who loiters outside Café Martin most Thursdays. Cap, brown coat, smokes occasionally, middle-aged. Camphor scent." Lucas raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. "Witnesses? None needed. Ask the baker next door, or the bartender across the way. Ask the postman. Someone will know. Quiet men are always seen by the ones who aren't noticed." As Lucas turned to leave, Maigret added. And ask if anyone knows Madame Le Sueur, not just her building. The street, alone again. Maigret stood by the window and stared out at the scene. A barge moved slowly beneath the Pont Marie, its wake parting the river like a sigh. He remembered the girl at the café, not the man, not the waiter, but the girl, young, no older than 25, sitting near the edge of the terrace under the canopy, a sketch pad in front of her, but no pencil in hand. She had glanced toward Madame Le Sueur once, quickly, then never again. But the glance had not been idle. He made his way back to the café in the early evening, when the regulars came in and the light behind the windows turned warm and thick with smoke. The waiter recognized him, now, gave him a respectful nod, and offered a quiet bonsoir, monsieur. Maigret sat at the bar this time. The girl who was sitting on the terrace today, he said. She comes often? The waiter shrugged, polished a glass with a cloth. Couple of times a week. Doesn't eat, just sits. Sometimes draws. Quiet. Does she know the old woman, Madame Le Sueur? The waiter frowned. I don't think so. Never seen them speak. But she looked at her. The waiter paused, then gave a faint nod. Yes. Sometime. Does the girl live nearby? Don't know. But she always comes from the same direction. Rue Sedaine, wears the same green coat. A bit torn at the cuff. Maigret thanked him and finished his beer slowly, the foam settling in lazy spirals. Outside, the streets had darkened to a sheen of wet cobblestone and yellow light. He pulled his collar up and made his way toward Rue Sedaine. He did not expect to find her. Not at this hour, but he walked anyway, letting the evening guide him through the routine hush of apartment windows, shutters half closed against the damp. He was not searching. He was preparing, letting the pieces shape themselves. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting with a thin smile and a slip of paper. The man, name's Roland Bouvrier, lives alone on Rue Saint-Sabine, was an accountant, took early retirement. The baker says he comes every Thursday, always around the same time, sometimes just walks by, sometimes sits, never speaks. Maigret took the paper and studied it without reading. And Madame Lizard? He asked. Lucas hesitated. There's something odd. A man used to visit her, not family. A friend of her husband's, maybe, but it stopped a few months ago. No one knows why. One of the neighbors said there was an argument, said the man shouted in the stairwell. Maigret rubbed his temple with a thick finger. Name? Julien Monet. Lives in Montreuil. Used to serve with Le Sueur in the gendarmerie, and now works as a security guard. Retired early from police service. Keeps to himself. Maigret leaned back in his chair and let the silence wrap itself around him. The umbrella still rested nearby, silent and stubborn. So a widow, a returned umbrella, a drawer left open, a man who lingers without speaking, a girl who watches from a distance, and a man who used to shout but doesn't come anymore. Nothing sharp, nothing clear, just edges, blurred and wet like the city itself. He would go to Montreuil tomorrow, quietly, without introduction. Tonight, he would smoke his pipe and listen to the rain grow heavier against the glass, and he would wait, the way he always did, for people to begin revealing what they had hidden from themselves. The morning air in Montreuil was heavier than in Paris, thick with the damp scent of autumn leaves clinging to the curbs and the distant smoke of wood fires curling up from the chimneys of smaller homes. Maigret arrived, not long after 8, his coat buttoned to the top, scarf tucked in tightly, though the chill did not bother him. He walked slowly from the station, past shuttered boulangeries and cafes still dragging chairs out onto the sidewalk, letting the rhythm of the town settle over him. It was not Paris here, not exactly. Quieter, more inward, the kind of place where people came to forget or to be forgotten. Julien Monet's building stood at the far end of a cul-de-sac lined with narrow birch trees and low stone walls, not grand, not poor. A squat structure with 5 flats, an iron gate that hung open from its latch, and a front door that bore the scratch marks of years of use but no name on the bell. Maigret stood there a moment, reading the silence. He pressed the bell once. No sound. Then again, a slow shuffle answered, the kind that spoke not of hesitation, but of resignation. The door opened on a man just past 70, tall, with large, bony wrists visible beneath a wool sweater, and a face carved more by weather than by age. His eyes, however, were alert, too alert for someone with nothing to hide. Yes? Julien Mornay? I am. Maigret offered no name. May I speak with you a moment? Mornay hesitated. Not because he didn't recognize Maigret, he didn't, but because the tone, the stance, the steady gaze all belonged to a man who didn't need to explain himself. I've nothing to sell, and no need for churchmen. I'm not either. Maigret replied simply. That pause stretched. Then Mornay stepped back and waved him inside. The flat was clean but bleak. One main room with a sagging divan, a bookshelf that looked untouched, and a gas heater that buzzed faintly as it struggled to warm the corners. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and boiled vegetables. A cane rested by the arm of the chair. I used to know a Jules Lesseur, Maigret said, his voice light, conversational. Mornay glanced at him sharply, but said nothing. He's dead now. January. Widow still lives on Rue du Chemin Vert. Mornay lowered himself into the chair slowly, with a wince that was more pride than pain. I knew Jules. We served together in 45, and after, gendarmerie in Lyon, then Paris. Good man. Close. Mornay gave a one-shouldered shrug, as close as you get when you've seen a man pull corpses out of rivers and not go mad. You stopped visiting his wife. Another pause, a long one. Mornay looked at the small clock on the mantel as if it had just spoken. Was that her complaint? Maigret didn't answer. She asked you to come. Mornay asked finally. No. That answer settled like dust between them. Mornay leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I visited, yes, often after Jules died. Brought her things, checked in. She's a proud woman, and pride can get heavy. Something changed. She told me to stop coming. Why? Ask her. I'm asking you. Mornay's jaw shifted, working the answer before it was given, because I offered her help. More help than she wanted. She thought it was pity. Maybe it was. Maybe I mistook habit for care. I don't know. I didn't argue. Maigret didn't interrupt. He waited. Mornay glanced toward the cane, then looked away. I shouted, yes, not at her. At myself. At the hallway. At the air. I had no right to be angry, but I was, and then I stopped going. Maigret nodded, almost imperceptibly. You ever see anyone else there? Come or go? No. She keeps to herself. She ever mentioned someone taking her things, or returning them? Now the older man leaned forward, brows furrowed. Taking what? An umbrella, for instance. Mornay scoffed, then caught himself. No. She wouldn't talk about small things. She talks about the war, about Jules, about how her hands don't work like they used to. But never umbrellas. Would you be surprised if she were frightened? Mornay blinked. Of course. That apartment was her fortress. She doesn't even open the windows unless it's July. What's happened? Maigret didn't answer. He stood. Mornay made no move to rise. If you still care for her, Maigret said gently, you'll stay away. For now. The man looked up slowly. She's in danger. I don't know. Not yet. But something's pushing at the corners of her life. And people don't push like that, unless they want to be seen. Outside, the wind had picked up, chasing the mist into corners where it gathered like secrets. Maigret lit his pipe and let the smoke curl around his face before exhaling slowly. He did not yet know what role Mornay played, sorrowful friend, rejected suitor, harmless ghost, but he wasn't part of the lie. Not directly. By midday, he was back in Paris. He stopped by the café again, not to watch, but to observe absence. Madame Lesseur was not there, Neither was the girl with the sketchbook. The same waiter greeted him, and Maigret asked casually if she had come. Not today, the young man said, wiping down the bar. Though yesterday she stayed longer than usual. Did she speak to anyone? No. But when she left, she went the other way. Which way? The waiter pointed toward Rue Servin. That meant nothing. And yet, Maigret returned to the office and found Lucas sorting through paperwork. The girl with the sketchbook, Maigret said. Find her. Lucas looked up, weary but focused. No name. She walks from Rue Sedaine, torn cuff, green coat, draws but never finishes. Look at art supply shops, evening schools, places that teach sketching. I'll need a day. Maigret nodded. And Devrier? Lucas handed over a report. He has no record, paid his taxes, no complaints. But he used to live in the same building as the Lesseurs 3 years ago. That caught Maigret's attention. Same floor, directly above. That detail sat still in Maigret's mind like a stone dropped into still water. Not making waves yet, just pressing downward. Why did he leave? Lucas flipped a page. No reason given. Moved to Rue Sainte-Sabine. Does Madame Lesseur know? Lucas shook his head. I don't think she even noticed. Maigret stood by the stove again, warming his hands though the room was not cold. He looked at the umbrella once more, then at the city beyond the window. A city where every apartment had eyes, every wall had ears, and every silence eventually gave itself away. Someone had once lived above her, and now sat quietly at her cafe, watching. Someone had exchanged her umbrella, not for theft but to make a point. Someone had returned it, damp, after walking in her steps. Someone had opened a drawer, not to steal, but to remind her that they could. Not madness, not mischief. Message. And messages, Maigret knew, were always meant to be read slowly. That evening Maigret sat in the dim glow of his office, pipe in hand, staring at the umbrella, leaning in the corner like an old acquaintance who refused to leave. Rain pattered gently against the window pane. The silence around him was thick, the kind that collected in rooms with too much thinking and too little said. He did not stir for nearly an hour. Only when Lucas returned, his coat damp and face flushed with cold, did the stillness break. I found her, Lucas said, peeling off his scarf. Name's Hélène Girard, 23. Lives in a room on Rue Sedaine, above a tailor's shop, pays by the month, registered at the École des Beaux-Arts evening class, sketching section, keeps to herself, but quiet, not difficult. Maigret nodded once. She's not just watching. She's remembering. Lucas blinked. You think she knew Madame Lesseur? Think she knew Madame Lesseur? Think she knew Madame Lesseur? I think she saw something. Maybe not a crime, maybe not a moment, but something that didn't belong. He tapped out his pipe in the ashtray and stood, his joints protesting slightly. Where is she now? According to the landlady, she left about an hour ago with her sketchbook. Said she was going to draw near the canal. Maigret took his coat from the hook. I'll go, he said. Alone. Outside the rain had faded to a fine mist that curled along the gutters like breath. He walked at a deliberate pace through the narrow streets of the 11th arrondissement, past shuttered bakeries and the soft glow of butcher shops preparing for morning. The canal lay ahead like a stretch of steel under the street lamps. A few figures moved along the towpath, a couple with a dog, a cyclist, a man in a fisherman's cap who paused to light a cigarette. Then he saw her. She sat beneath a lamppost, sketchbook resting on her lap, a green coat buttoned to the neck. The tear at her cuff had grown, threads curling outward like tiny veins. Her head was tilted slightly, her pencil still. Maigret slowed as he approached, saying nothing, simply stepping into her periphery. I knew you'd come, she said without turning. Why? Because I've been sitting in plain sight for too long. Maigret lowered himself onto the bench beside her, with a quiet grunt. She continued staring at the canal, though the pencil never moved. I don't draw much anymore, she murmured. I just hold the book. It makes people ignore me. like I'm not really there. Maigret said nothing. He had no questions ready. No accusation, only silence. And that had always been enough. I used to live above her, the girl said softly. When my mother died, I moved into that building. The rent was cheap. And she was kind, in a way that didn't ask for anything back. Maigret waited. She always left at 3 on Thursdays. Same time. Same coat. Same step. I would hear her shoes go down the stairs. And then it was quiet. She finally turned toward him. Her eyes were clear, but tired. One Thursday I heard something else. Not her steps going down. Someone coming up. When was this? 3 months ago. I didn't think of it then. It didn't register until I heard she'd lost her umbrella. I remembered that I heard someone enter her flat. Not forcefully, like they had a key. I thought maybe I imagined it. You knew it wasn't her returning. She has a particular way of walking. Careful. Small steps. This was heavier. A man, I think. Did you look? She shook her head. I was too frightened. I listened. That was all. Whoever it was, they stayed inside for 10 minutes. Maybe more. Then they left. They closed the door softly. And I left not long after. It began to feel wrong. Not just the sound, but the silence afterward. It felt like someone was watching her, or waiting for something. You know Roland Bouvrier? She hesitated. He lived upstairs before me. I never met him, but Madame Lesoeur mentioned him once. Said he was polite, but strange. Moved out suddenly. Left no forwarding. Maigret exhaled, clouding the damp air. I think she's being punished. Hélène said suddenly, her voice low. But I don't know for what. Only that someone wants her to remember something she'd rather forget. Maigret turned to her now. Or perhaps someone wants to be remembered by her. She stared at him. Is there a difference? He didn't answer. They sat a while longer, neither speaking. The canal flowed darkly beside them, holding the secrets of the city in its depths. When he rose, she handed him her sketchbook. Page 3, she said. It's not a portrait, just a feeling. He nodded, and she left without looking back. Later, in his office, Maigret turned to page 3. It wasn't detailed. A series of charcoal lines and shadows, the impression of a hallway, a door slightly ajar, a coat stand missing one hook. But the angle was wrong, deliberately distorted, as if someone had drawn not what they saw but what they remembered seeing too late. The next morning Maigret took the umbrella and walked again to Rue de Chemin Vert. Madame Lesoeur answered in her dressing gown, her hair undone, eyes faintly swollen as if sleep had only skimmed her. I heard someone again, she whispered. Last night. But there was no knock. Just the sound of something, placed near the door. He stepped inside. On the small table in the corridor, beneath the radiator, was a matchbox. He picked it up. It was from the café. Inside were 3 used matches and 1 whole. You smoke, Madame Lesoeur? No. He held the box up. This was meant for you to find. She said nothing, but her hands, curled at her sides, trembled. Later, Maigret returned to the file on Roland Bouvrier. There was nothing concrete, no threats, no trespass, but there was a pattern, a closeness that had shifted into something colder. A man who used to live above her, who knew her habits, who visited the café not for leisure but for ritual. Maigret scribbled 2 lines on a paper and passed it to Lucas. Have him brought in, he said quietly. Nothing official, just a conversation. When Bouvrier entered that evening, his eyes flicked toward the umbrella in the corner. Maigret noticed. They sat across from one another. You've been watching her, Maigret said without preamble. Bouvrier gave a small, tired smile. That isn't a crime. No. But swapping umbrellas, entering her flat, that edges toward something else. I only returned what was hers, after holding it. After making sure she'd notice it had been held. Silence. I miss the sound of her living, Bouvrier said at last. Her steps, The kettle, the way she sang to herself on Sunday mornings when she thought no one heard. You moved out. I had to. I said something once. Asked if she wanted company. She recoiled, said I was inappropriate. I was ashamed, so I left. And now? I just wanted her to remember I existed. She does, Maigret said, and she's afraid. Brivrier looked down at his hands. I never meant harm. No, Maigret replied. Just discomfort, lingering doubt. A question that wouldn't go away. He stood, signaling the end. As Beauvrier reached the door, Maigret added, loneliness isn't a reason to make others feel unsafe. Beauvrier nodded, almost bowed, then left. That night, Maigret returned the umbrella to Madame Lesueur. She stood in her doorway, silent. He won't return, Maigret said. I'm not sure that matters, she replied, because now I know someone could. He placed the umbrella gently against her wall and tipped his hat. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the night was thick with quiet, and he sat once more by the stove, not triumphant, not burdened, only tired. The case had closed not with a crime, but with a silence explained, a fear named, a message read and answered. Sometimes that was all justice required. Maigret did not file a report. There would be no formal paperwork, no summons, no statement entered into the register. What had transpired between Madame Lesueur and the man who had once lived above her did not fit the dimensions of a legal incident. It fit the softer, more elusive category. Maigret had come to understand too well over the years, a wound that lived just below the skin of routine, where fear was not provoked by danger, but by suggestion. But even so, something tugged at him. In the days that followed, he kept the umbrella, not because he had forgotten to return it, but because the presence of it on the coat rack across from his desk acted as a kind of silent reminder, a loose thread. Beauvrier had confessed to the ritual, the watching, the returned object. The message meant not to harm, but to be seen. And yet Maigret had the uncomfortable feeling that Beauvrier, in his quiet need, had only become the final actor in a pattern already written. The sketchbook haunted him. Not because of what it revealed, a shadowed hallway, a door half open, but because of what it left out. The angle had been wrong, not merely distorted, but tilted, as if Hélène Girard had drawn it from a place she couldn't admit she'd been. That detail, combined with the vague timeline, her refusal to look back at the café when Madame Lesueur arrived, it lingered. He visited the École des Beaux-Arts under the pretext of viewing public sketching submissions. The instructor, a middle-aged man with ink on his cuffs and the habitual aloofness of minor importance, recognized the name but knew little. Promising eye, he said absently. But she's not consistent, doesn't complete things, as though she stops herself just before finishing. Maigret had nodded and made no remark. That was the sense he had, too, that Hélène was drawing not for expression but for concealment. That evening he returned to Rue Sedaine and stood across the street from the tailor's shop beneath her building. A shutter was halfway closed, and through it he saw her seated by the window, chin in hand, sketchbook open but untouched. She was not drawing, she was waiting. Maigret didn't go up. He turned and walked the long way home, past cafes emptying out, past windows beginning to glow with the soft domestic light of those who had not yet been disturbed. His wife greeted him with silence and soup. He sat down and said nothing. Afterward he smoked in the kitchen while she folded laundry. Rain began again outside, gently. The next morning he returned to Rue du Chemin Vert. Madame Lesueur answered after a moment, not surprised, only wearier. She stepped aside for him to enter, then resumed knitting at the table as if he were no more than a passing thought. He sat across from her and waited until her fingers paused mid-row. "Have you remembered anything?" he asked quietly. Her eyes stayed on the yarn. "What sort of thing?" "Anything that felt unspoken, unfinished." She gave a brittle smile. "At my age, everything feels unfinished." He let the silence stretch. She did not feel it, but her fingers began to tremble faintly. the needles clicking unevenly. "I told you once," she said softly, "that I don't sleep as well now." "Yes?" She laid the needles down. "There's a drawer in my bedroom I haven't opened in years. Not out of sentiment, but avoidance. When Jules died, I locked it. I didn't want to touch what he had left behind." Maigret didn't speak. "I opened it last night." The room felt suddenly colder, though nothing had changed. "There was nothing taken," she continued, voice thin. "But the letters were moved. I could feel it. A woman knows when someone else has handled what she kept private." "Letters." She nodded. "From a girl. Not Helene. Someone else. She wrote often asking for help, money, advice. Jules never told me who she was, but he answered her. I found his replies, folded neatly beneath hers, always firm, never cruel. What kind of help? She wrote of a place she couldn't stay, a man who frightened her. She mentioned threats, but never names." Maigret reached across the table. "May I see them?" She hesitated, then rose slowly and left the room. When she returned, she held a small bundle, bound with a plain black ribbon. He untied them gently. The handwriting was young, careless, lines crossed out, emotion barely contained, desperation peeking out between words that tried to sound polite. One letter, dated nearly 4 years prior, struck him hardest. "He says no one will believe me. He says if I speak, I'll disappear like before. You said I should be careful, and I have been. But he's in the building now. Sometimes I hear him walking past my door, stopping. I don't open it. I can't. Please, I don't want to be like the others." Maigret stared at the word others until it lost its shape. The reply from Jules Lesieur was short, cautious, restrained. "If you're truly in danger, you must leave. I cannot protect you from what I do not see. Do not write again. Destroy this." Maigret folded the letters carefully. "She never signed a name?" "No." He stood. "May I keep these?" She nodded. "They frighten me now." Outside, the sky had turned a low, flat silver. A breeze picked up. Tugging faintly at the folds of his coat, he returned to the office and laid the letters before Lucas. 4 years ago," he said, "a girl wrote to Lesieur from within his own building. Someone was stalking her, threatening her, possibly more. And he didn't tell his wife, he only warned her off." Lucas read quickly. "You think Beuvrier?" "No, too recent. He moved in after this." "Then who?" "I want every tenant from that building," Maigret said. "Past 5 years, especially the floor above." Lucas nodded and left. Maigret sat back and stared at the letters again. The girl had vanished from them. No return address, no signature, no final word. She had disappeared long before she'd stopped writing. He thought again of Helene Girard, of the way she said, "I thought, maybe I imagined it." A girl like that wouldn't be mistaken, but she might pretend she had been. When Lucas returned, he carried a sheet of names. 3rd floor right, 2019, Jean-Noël Varneau, age 46, worked at a locksmith's, fired after multiple absences. 2 complaints from female tenants for inappropriate comments. No charges, moved suddenly, left no trace. Maigret read the name again. "Find out where he is now," he said quietly. The umbrella remained where it always had, its silver handle faintly dulled by time. The first object touched in this quiet unfolding. The first signal, but now, perhaps, not the last. Perhaps not. It was just after 4 when Lucas returned. The sound of his steps clipped and precise in the corridor, the sort that betrayed the tension he kept hidden behind his composed face. He carried no folder, only the weight of something half-confirmed. "We found him," he said as he entered. "Jean-Noël Varneau lives now in Ivry-sur-Seine. Room above a garage, rented under another name, Hervé Mignot." The landlady recognized the photo, but didn't know the alias. Said he keeps odd hours, doesn't speak much, works nights. "What kind of work?" Maigret asked. Lucas hesitated. Security, supposedly, but nothing registered. He disappears for stretches. Maigret rose slowly and reached for his coat. Let's go. They arrived in Ivry-sur-Seine as the sky dimmed into slate. The streets there were quieter, less hurried, rows of shuttered workshops and bars where no one looked long at passing strangers. The garage stood at the end of a short gravel path, behind a cracked stucco wall and a rusted iron gate left half open. Upstairs, a single light burned weakly behind yellowed curtains. They didn't knock immediately. Maigret stood at the bottom of the steps, hands deep in his pockets, listening. The smell of grease drifted down from the garage bay, though no sound of work followed it. A cat darted across the yard and vanished under a pile of discarded tires. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed. Then silence again, complete, except for the wind rising faintly in the hedges. When they knocked, the door opened not cautiously, but too quickly, as though the man inside had already been standing there. Jean-Noël Varneau filled the frame, lean and unshaven, with a long face that held no welcome. Only fatigue. His eyes were the sort that had learned to survive by narrowing. Maigret didn't speak. He merely stepped forward. Varneau didn't stop him. He backed up, wordless, as if part of him had expected this. The room was small. Bed, table, wash basin, a single chair, draped with a jacket too thin for the weather. There was no clutter, only absence. Even the ashtray was clean. Maigret stood near the table and said quietly, "You used to live on Rue du Chambert." Varneau gave a shallow nod. "Third floor, above Madame Lazure." "Years ago," he said. "You left in 2019. After 2 complaints." Varneau said nothing. "You work as a locksmith." "Worked. You stopped after you were let go." He nodded again, this time with a trace of something darker. Not regret, but something almost like defiance dulled by exhaustion. "Do you know the name Hélène Girard?" A flicker crossed Varneau's face, the barest wince, as if a muscle had tightened behind the eyes. "She was a neighbor." Maigret moved slowly toward the window. "She says she heard someone enter Madame Lesureur's apartment one Thursday. A few months ago." Still silence. "She didn't see a face, but she remembered the sound of the lock. Said it was too clean, too practiced. Not broken, not forced. Just quiet." Maigret turned. "You were a locksmith." Varneau's gaze dropped to the floor. His hands tightened at his sides, not in threat, but in some private restraint. He looked, in that moment, like someone trying very hard not to vanish into himself. Maigret stepped closer, not with accusation, but with certainty. "There were letters, from a girl, years ago. You frightened her. You told her if she spoke she'd disappear like before." Still no answer, just the faintest clenching of the jaw. "She lived in that building. She's gone now. We don't know her name, only that she feared you, and that she reached out to someone who never answered." He let the words hang. "You returned recently. Not to hurt Madame Lesueur, but to haunt her. To remind her that something happened. Something she never knew. You wanted her to feel it. That thin line of fear." Varneau's voice came at last, low and hoarse. "No one ever cared." Maigret watched him. No one even asked. He sat down abruptly on the bed, as though something inside had given way. "She begged me to stop," Varneau said, staring at the floor. Not loudly, not even angrily. Just begged. "She said she'd be good, as if she thought that mattered. And after?" Maigret asked softly. "I left. I didn't touch her. I didn't mean to frighten her. I only—" His hands opened and closed. "I just wanted someone to see me." Maigret nodded. "They did, and they still do." They brought him in. Not under arrest. Not yet. There was no proof of violence, no missing persons report, no complaint to tie him to anything more than presence. But Maigret made sure the name was entered, the questions written. Sometimes justice did not come in one movement, but in the act of finally naming what had long remained unnamed. At the office, Maigret laid the letters down again, one by one, reading the girl's voice not as evidence, but as echo. She had lived, she had feared, she had written, and someone had read. In the morning he returned once more to Madame Leisseau's door. She opened it and simply said, "It was him, wasn't it?" Maigret nodded. "I always thought the building felt different after he left. Quieter, but colder. You're safe now." She gave a thin smile. "There's no such thing, but I'll sleep better, even if only slightly." He left the umbrella with her, resting it gently back where it belonged, by the radiator where she always kept it, dry, folded, silent. Later, in his office, he stood by the stove, pipe unlit, watching the river drift beyond the wet windows. The rain had returned, soft and unremarkable. Across the room, Lucas filed the last sheet away and turned off the desk lamp. "No report?" he asked. Maigret shook his head. "No crime on paper. Just something unfinished that needed someone to hear it." Lucas paused. "And the girl?" Maigret exhaled. She was believed. At last. Even if too late. Outside, the city exhaled under the slow hush of evening. No sirens, no arrests. Only the quiet return of stillness, earned, not assumed. Maigret remained by the stove long after the others had gone, letting the silence fill in the spaces where guilt had once crept. Not every case closed, but some, at least, were quieted. By the next afternoon the rain had stopped, but the city remained subdued, as if caught between the rhythms of weather and memory. Streets were washed clean, but not bright. Leaves clung to the sidewalks in dark, sodden clusters. In Maigret's office the umbrella was gone, not misplaced, simply returned to its rightful place, and with it something unspoken had been resolved. But not everything. There were still threads left trailing just beneath the surface, and one in particular had not been pulled tight. He kept thinking of Hélène Girard. She had appeared in this matter, like a passing shadow, soft, uncertain, peripheral, yet she had heard something no one else had. She had drawn what others ignored, and she had held, silently, the tension of a building that remembered too much. Her sketchbook had not told a full story, only hinted at the emotional geometry of a space once filled with dread. But Maigret had learned over years not to ignore those who claimed to know nothing while staring too direct. At dusk, he found himself once again walking down Rue Sedaine. The streetlights had just begun to flicker on, one by one, turning the pale buildings gold at their edges. A shopkeeper was rolling down a metal shutter. The tailor below Hélène's apartment nodded faintly as Maigret passed, as if recognizing the slow step of someone who no longer pretended he was out for anything else but what he sought. He rang the bell. A pause, then footsteps above. The door creaked open, and she stood there in the same green coat, now buttoned to the neck, her hair tied back loosely as if she'd been preparing to go out, but changed her mind halfway. "I wondered if you would come again," she said, her voice even. "I had the same thought," Maigret replied. She stepped back to let him in, closing the door gently behind him. The room was warmer than he expected, not just physically, but in tone. A small stove glowed orange in the corner, and the sketchbook was on the table, closed this time, a pencil resting beside it. He sat without waiting to be offered the chair. "I spoke to the man," he said. "Or not." She tensed but did not ask what had been said. She knew. "He frightened you, didn't he?" Maigret asked gently. She nodded, slowly. "I was 17, she said. I'd just moved into that building, cheap rent, no questions. I thought I could disappear there. I had left something behind that I didn't want to carry anymore. But then I saw him, and it was like stepping into another trap." She looked down at her hands, pressing her thumb into her palm. "He watched everyone, but me more than the others. I could feel it. I once found a note slipped under my door. Nothing written, just one of his matchbooks, the kind he always had in his coat. I tried to tell the landlady, but she shrugged, said he was harmless. He wasn't. Did he hurt you? No. But he could have. And that was enough. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the rooftops. I thought of leaving so many times, but I had nowhere to go. And then one day he vanished. Just like that. I thought it was over, but you kept watching Madame Le Soeur, Maigret said, because I thought maybe it hadn't ended. Maybe it had only moved. She turned, her expression neither sad nor relieved, only tired in the way that young people shouldn't be. And when the umbrella was taken, it was so small, so absurd. I knew he was back. Not for me, but for her, or what she represented. She never knew. Maigret said, I know. That's what frightened me most. They sat in silence, the soft tick of the stove the only sound between them. I didn't say anything before, she said at last, because I didn't think it would matter. No one believed me then. Why would they now? I believe you. She nodded once, accepting it, not as comfort, but as a kind of quiet acknowledgement of harm. Survived. Harm. I'm not going to testify, she added after a while. I'm not going to write anything down. I wouldn't ask you to. Maigret rose. He looked at the sketchbook on the table. Will you finish it? I don't know, she said. Maybe. But not for anyone else. He nodded, and without another word let himself out. The city had gone quieter with the deepening dark. He walked slowly toward the metro, not because he was in any hurry to be elsewhere, but because he had learned over time to respect the pause after resolution, the silence that came not from closure but from acknowledgement. What had unraveled between Madame Le Soeur and her invisible tormentor had not been a case, not in the formal sense. It had been a presence, a shadow moving through years, and that shadow had brushed more than one life. At Cours des Orfèvres, Lucas looked up when he entered. Anything more? No, Maigret said. Not more. Just the rest. He sat at his desk and took out a sheet of paper. He didn't fill it with dates, or names or offenses. He wrote simply, there are kinds of harm that don't bruise, only press. Some women live with pressure for so long that when it's gone, they still feel it. He folded the paper and tucked it into the umbrella stand, where Madame Le Soeur's umbrella had once rested. A strange place for it, perhaps, but fit. Later, as the office emptied and the lights dimmed across the river, Maigret remained seated, smoking in the near dark, watching the city from his window as though waiting for it to speak. It didn't, but it no longer needed to. It was 2 days later when Maigret returned to Rue du Chemin Vert one final time, not to investigate, not to inquire, but because something inside him resisted the idea of letting the street fade into silence without revisiting its contours. The air had turned milder, brushed by a weak autumn sun, and the building stood under it with the same gray hush, as if the past week had not stirred anything at all. But Maigret knew better. What had shifted was invisible, the kind of shift that leaves the furniture untouched but realigns the air. He walked without hurry. At the door of number 86, he paused, not to press the bell, but to listen. There were no footsteps, no hallway whispers, no doors opening too softly. He didn't expect any. Still, he waited a moment longer, letting the place speak to him the way it always had. Then he climbed the stairs slowly, one hand grazing the wall as though the texture of the paint might still hold some remnant of the story. Madame Le Soeur opened the door even before he knocked. She was wearing a navy cardigan buttoned all the way up, and her hair was pinned more tightly than usual. She didn't smile, but neither was she surprised. You knew I'd come, he said. Of course, she replied. There's always a last visit. He stepped in. The apartment smelled faintly of rose water and boiled onions, the trace of a life quietly carried on. The umbrella stood neatly by the radiator again, its silver handle polished. She gestured toward the armchair, and he sat without removing his coat. I've started taking the long way to the café, she said, sitting opposite him, not out of fear, but because I realized I never noticed the neighborhood. You're walking for yourself now, Maigret said. She considered that. Yes, I suppose I am. There was a long, companionable silence. Then she said, What will happen to him? Varnot? For now, nothing. There's no formal complaint, no charge, but his name's in the books. And he knows he's been seen. She gave a slow nod. That's enough for some men. It is. She folded her hands in her lap, and her gaze drifted to the small table where the letters had once been. They were gone now, burned perhaps or stored somewhere safer, though Maigret didn't ask. She met his eyes again. I think I always sensed something was wrong in this building. Even when Jules was alive, he was a good man, but he kept compartments in his soul. I was never allowed in all of them. We all do, Maigret said. Even the best of us. I wonder what might have changed if he'd told me about the girl. Maybe nothing. But maybe she would have felt less alone. She nodded slowly, and her voice softened. I've never had children. I don't know what it's like to be needed in that way. But I imagine that letter, that voice asking for help, was the closest I ever came to being part of something fragile. Maigret did not reply. He only watched her, and in that moment, she looked neither old nor particularly frail, just quietly resolved. A woman who had opened a drawer one evening and found not objects, but questions she hadn't known she'd buried. I'm not afraid anymore, she said finally. Not of him. Not of what I didn't know. That's good. But I am changed, she added. It's not the same thing. Maigret rose. No, it isn't. They didn't shake hands. She simply stood at the door as he left, and as he descended the stairs he felt the weight of the case begin to lift. Not entirely, but enough. Outside, he lit his pipe and walked toward the canal. The city was carrying on around him, as it always did. People passed by with umbrellas under their arms, folded neatly. A man swept leaves from the threshold of a bakery. Somewhere a church bell rang 4:30. He found himself drawn to the cafe again, not for answers, but for the atmosphere of it. He sat near the back this time, where the light from the awning fell just so across the stone tabletop. The waiter recognized him and brought his beer without being asked. She was there too, Hélène Girard, seated near the window with her sketchbook open. But this time she was drawing. Her head was tilted slightly, pencil moving with sure, steady strokes. She didn't notice him. Or perhaps she did, and chose not to show it. He didn't disturb her. Instead, he watched the way she moved the pencil in slow, curved lines, not hurried, not unfinished, not distorted. It was as if, at last, she had given herself permission to observe without fear. He nursed the beer slowly, his mind neither racing nor still. It was like watching dusk arrive. Inevitable, soft-edged and filled with everything unspoken. No resolutions today. No arrest, but somewhere between the umbrella returned to its place, and the girl beginning again on the page. Something had settled. Later, as the cafe began to empty, he stood and left without speaking to her. As he passed her table, he glanced once, briefly. What she was sketching wasn't a face, or a street, or a memory. It was a hand. Simple, unadorned, holding a cup, calm, still, present. Outside, the clouds had parted just enough to reveal a narrow band of twilight blue. He didn't go back to the office. He walked slowly along the edge of the canal, pipe in hand, the soft scent of tobacco mingling with the last moisture rising off the stone. And in the quiet rhythm of his steps, in the wet hush of Paris folding into night, he felt the story close not with finality, but with understanding. The umbrella had been returned, but more than that, so had a sense of self. To a woman who once trembled, to a girl who once feared, and to a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Only listen. It was a week later when the letter arrived. Maigret found it among the usual stack of dull official correspondence and handwritten bills in the Morning Post. Its envelope unremarkable, except for the faintest scent of lavender. and a thinness to the paper that suggested deliberation. There was no return address. Inside, a single sheet, carefully folded. Inspector, I've decided to leave Paris. I don't know for how long. Maybe only until the streets stop reminding me of places I was once afraid to be seen. You never asked for thanks, so I won't offer it. But I will say this. You made me feel like someone's silence finally mattered. That's rare. I'm taking my sketchbook with me, and this time I intend to fill every page. Wait, gee. Maigret read it only once, then refolded the page and slipped it back into its envelope. He didn't place it in a drawer or keep it on his desk. He simply tucked it inside his coat pocket and left it there, where it would crease and soften and fade into the lining. Carried without fanfare, he had known she would leave. People like Hélène didn't stay in places where they'd been rendered invisible. When the danger passed, the city still held the echo. She hadn't vanished, only moved on with dignity reclaimed. That same afternoon, Madame Lesueur came into the station. Not by summons. She arrived of her own accord, dressed neatly in a gray coat with a faint silk scarf at her throat, her hair set with careful hands. She carried no umbrella. The sky was dry and blue. She asked at the front desk for Maigret, and when shown in, she waited by the stove with a faintly amused patience, as though stepping into his domain had always been inevitable. I've been thinking, she said once he joined her, about what you said. About being remembered. He offered her coffee, which she declined. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, as if she had made peace with her own place in the world again. For years I told myself I was only a witness to things, she said. Jules had his life, his letters, even the girl. She was part of something he kept separate. But I was wrong. I wasn't a witness. I was just quiet. Maigret did not interrupt. Her voice was measured, composed, but there was something in it that rang deeper than mere reflection. The other day, she went on. I sat in the cafe, as always, and I noticed I no longer watched the door. I no longer expected to see shadows I couldn't name. He gave a small nod. Whatever he was trying to do, she added, it's over. Not because he was caught, but because I stopped letting him write the silence around me. They spoke of nothing else. She did not ask what would happen next. She had already moved past the questions. When she rose to leave, she glanced once at the umbrella still leaning in the corner of the room. Not out of fear or ownership but memory, and smiled faintly. Outside, the city was shifting toward spring, even if the air still carried winter's sharpness. Maigret returned to his desk and sat with the sound of her steps fading down the hall behind him. He reached for his pipe, struck a match, and let the smoke drift upward toward the ceiling beams worn smooth by years of quiet decisions. There had been no arrest, no courtroom, no confession signed in ink. Only words spoken in unguarded rooms, drawings left unfinished, umbrellas swapped in silence. But in the delicate texture of those details, the smallest choices, the subtlest fears, the truth had taken shape. Not as a declaration, but as an atmosphere dispelled. A girl had been seen. A woman had been heard. A man had been made to feel the consequence of being watched. And Maigret, as always, had let it come not by force, but by waiting. He finished the bowl of his pipe, tapped it out gently, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, somewhere down the river, bells began to chime. Not sharply, not ceremoniously, just softly, folding into the city's rhythm, like breath returning to lungs long emptied. And in that rhythm, he let the story end.